The 41st millennium did not feel like a place so much as a slow collapse of meaning. Empires stretched across impossible distances only to lose entire sectors without explanation. Hive worlds burned under their own weight, their skylines reduced to silhouettes of smoke and industry. Warp storms swallowed star lanes and returned nothing but silence. In this galaxy, disappearance was more common than survival. The Mandalorian moved through it without allegiance. He took work where it existed and left before questions formed. On Varnak Hive, a world already half drowned in pollution and war, he completed an extraction inside the lower industrial tiers where light rarely reached the ground. The target tried to use civilians as cover, but Din Djarin did not linger on choices that complicated survival. He moved with precision through the corridors, armor-absorbing gunfire that would have torn through lesser men. When it ended quickly, and the living were left breathing. He did not celebrate. He rarely did. Grogu remained close, carried securely as the ship lifted above the hive's burning horizon. The child did not speak, but his attention rarely left the galaxy outside. There was something in it that weighed on him constantly, something that pressed inward through the Force like distant pain with no source. Every world they passed seemed to echo it more strongly. In the frontier systems of the Imperium, Din's reputation worked like currency. Black market brokers used him when deniability mattered, and Imperial intermediaries tolerated him when official channels failed. It was a narrow space to exist in, but it kept him moving. A contract ended without complication on the edge of a forgotten station. Payment transferred. Silence restored. That should have been the end of it. Instead, a new presence remained behind in the docking bay after the brokers left. A man stood waiting, hooded and still, as if he had always been there. No insignia marked him, but everything about him suggested authority that did not need introduction. Inquisitorial business, he said. Din did not reach for his weapon. Not yet. That usually means problems. It means opportunity. A data cylinder was placed on the table between them. One word illuminated in cold Imperial script, Helios Reach. Grogu reacted before Din did. His posture changed, ears lowering slightly, attention locking onto the name with unusual intensity. The figure continued. Quarantined world. Full isolation. No reliable contact for years. Every recovery attempt failed. Holographic data unfolded above the surface, a planet wrapped in violent atmospheric spirals, its surface fractured into dark continental scars. Entire regions were missing from sensor returns. And the asset? Din asked. A classified psychic entity. Designation restricted. Retrieval is the objective. Grogu's gaze stayed fixed on the projection longer than before. Something in it disturbed him, not visually, but beneath perception, where sensation replaced thought. Din reviewed the files. Fragmented reports. Audio logs corrupted by interference. Descriptions that contradicted each other, voices in corridors that were empty, shadows moving without light, crews reporting entire sections of ships vanishing while still aboard. Insanity was not a side effect in the reports. It was the outcome. Why not purge the planet? Din asked. That option is under consideration, the Inquisitor replied. You will retrieve the asset before it becomes necessary. There was no negotiation beyond that point. Later, the ship moved alone through a dangerous warp route toward Helios Reach. Space outside the hull stopped behaving like distance and became something closer to pressure. Instruments began to fail in subtle ways first, then all at once. Navigation drifted without input. Time stopped feeling consistent. Grogu refused to leave the cockpit. The ship grew quieter the deeper they traveled, as if sound itself was being stripped away. Then came the first distortions, reflections in metal panels that did not match movement, shadows that persisted too long after light sources shifted. At one point, Din walked through the corridor and saw something at the far end near the engine access hatch. A shape, upright, still, watching. He reached the hatch moments later. Nothing was there. The ship finally broke out of the warp with a violent return to physical space. Helios Reach appeared ahead. It was silent. A dead hive world wrapped in collapsing ash clouds and fractured atmospheric storms. No orbital defense systems. No traffic. No signal emissions. Entire regions of the planet were blacked out, as if erased rather than destroyed. Grogu stared through the viewport without blinking. Din adjusted the ship's approach vector, but paused when a final reading updated across the display. Something had moved beneath the clouds. Helios Reach did not look like a conquered world. It looked erased. The Mandalorian brought the ship through broken atmospheric layers where ash storms rolled like living walls, swallowing entire horizons in slow motion. Beneath them, the surface of the planet stretched into dead hive structures. Monolithic cities turned black and hollow, their spires cracked open like spent shells. No lights remained. No movement. Only the constant drift of particulate ruin and the distant glow of industrial fires still burning without purpose. Grogu watched in silence. His ears were lowered, his attention fixed outward in a way that felt heavier than curiosity. The landing zone was an abandoned Imperial district half buried under collapsed ferrocrete and ash. Radiation readings spiked without pattern, forcing Din to move carefully through alternating zones of electronic silence where even his helmet system struggled to maintain clarity. At times, the world simply stopped responding to technology, as if the planet rejected observation itself. The streets were empty until they were not. Shapes moved between ruined corridors, survivors that no longer behaved like survivors. Some wore fragments of Imperial uniforms fused into their skin. Others had become incomplete things, drawn toward instinct rather than thought. Deeper within the hive's collapsed layers, failed psyker experiments wandered through broken tunnels, reacting violently to proximity, as if sensing living presence as intrusion. Combat came without warning. In the narrow corridors of a collapsed transit artery, Din engaged at close range. Blaster fire lit the dust-filled air in short bursts. He did not waste motion. Each shot ended a threat before it became a pattern. Grogu remained close, protected within the rhythm of movement, reacting instinctively to danger before it fully formed. But the planet was not only physical. Grogu began to feel it more strongly as they descended. There was suffering embedded in the structure of Helios Reach itself. Not echoes of memory, but something still present, compressed into the walls and systems of the hive. It pressed inward through the force in fragmented waves, like distant voices trapped behind layers of metal and stone. They discovered the first intact Mechanicus archive beneath a collapsed data chapel. The systems were partially functional, still looping corrupted logs under emergency power. Among them was a designation repeated across fragmented files. Project Lumen. The records described controlled experimentation on psychic children. Attempts to stabilize warp-sensitive cognition. Failures recorded in clinical terms that did not match the severity of the outcomes. Subjects were not listed as deceased, but as unresolved. Deeper entries referenced containment infrastructure beneath the hive, something large enough to require independent structural reinforcement. A sealed complex not designed for entry, but for permanence. They followed the coordinates downward. The descent into the vault complex removed the last sense of surface reality. Corridors became narrower, colder, stripped of all Imperial iconography. Machinery lined the walls in states of partial corrosion, still reacting faintly to presence. Some systems activated as they passed, not in defense, but in recognition. Inside, the environment degraded further. Failed clones moved in irregular patterns through maintenance halls. Corrupted machinery continued operating without input. Psychers restrained in forgotten chambers reacted to their presence with brief surges of psychic distress, collapsing back into silence moments later. The entire structure felt like a system still running after the purpose had ended. Grogu's vision began to fracture. He saw flashes that did not belong to the present, corridors filled with light that bent at impossible angles, figures suspended in place as if gravity had forgotten them, and something watching from behind layers of perception that had no name. He held on to Din's presence as an anchor against it. Din, too, began to feel the instability. Time lost coherence in small, subtle ways. Sounds arrived slightly before their sources. Shadows shifted independently of movement. The deeper they went, the more the environment resisted understanding. The final chamber was not guarded. It was waiting. Small, restrained within fractured containment restraints that no longer functioned fully. He did not struggle. He did not speak. His posture suggested awareness without urgency, as if he had been observing everything for a long time without needing participation. The air around him bent subtly, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that reality was adjusting itself in response to his presence. Grogu stepped forward first. Slowly. Carefully. The child's attention shifted toward him, and for the first time, something changed in his expression, an emotional response not triggered by fear or control, but recognition. Then the restraints failed. Not mechanically. All at once. A psychic shockwave erupted outward from the chamber, passing through the vault, the hive, and the world above it in a single expanding rupture of force. Helios Reach responded as if struck by an unseen impact. And everything began to wake up. The shockwave did not travel like a normal event. It passed through the warp first, then reality followed. Across nearby systems, astropathic choirs collapsed mid-transmission. Messages arrived fragmented, folded into themselves, ending in static that carried emotional weight rather than sound. Some astropaths died instantly, others screamed without understanding why, their minds overwhelmed by something they could not interpret as language. Within hours, Imperial command structures began receiving visions that did not belong to any sanctioned psychic channel. Entire fleets reported seeing the same impossible imagery, a dead world beneath ash storms, and at its center something that refused classification. The term used in the First Emergency Council was not precise, but it was unanimous. Omega Warp Threat. The Inquisition did not debate the nature of the child for long. The argument was not what it was, but what it would become if allowed to remain active. Containment was proposed and rejected almost immediately. The instability spreading from Helios Reach was already measurable across adjacent systems. Exterminatus was authorized. Fleet mobilization followed without delay. Imperial warships translated into the system's outer reaches, their arrival accompanied by the silent presence of Sisters of Silence vessels and null formation strike craft designed to suppress psychic resonance at range. Space Marine kill teams were prepared for surface deployment, though few expected retrieval to remain possible. Something worse happened before the bombardment began. Across nearby worlds, chaos cults that had remained dormant for decades suddenly activated in unison, as if responding to a signal they had been waiting for without knowing it existed. On Helios Reach, the Mandalorian moved before the Imperium fully committed to destruction. The vault was already failing. Gravity no longer behaved consistently. Entire corridors tilted without physical cause. Walls cracked inward, then outward, as if the structure could not decide which direction reality should hold. Above them, distant impacts marked the arrival of orbital strike craft beginning preliminary engagement. Din carried the child through collapsing corridors, armor cutting through dust and falling debris. Grogu remained close, but his focus had changed. He was no longer simply reacting to the environment, he was actively resisting it. A faint protective pressure extended outward from him, small but deliberate, stabilizing moments of collapse long enough for movement to continue. The Psyker child was no longer passive. His presence bent the structure of the vault itself, unintentionally at first. Doorways opened before they were reached. Structural beams shifted away from their path. At times, Imperial forces attempting to intercept them found themselves disoriented, as if the geometry of the corridor had been rewritten between steps. Null squads entered the ruins shortly after, their presence marked by an unnatural stillness in the air. Psychic sensation dulled in their proximity, but not evenly. Around the child, the null effect fractured, producing instability rather than suppression. The Mandalorian reached the surface extraction point under direct orbital fire. The sky above Helios Reach had already begun to split into burning layers. Cyclonic torpedoes descended in slow arcs, each impact erasing vast regions of continent in expanding waves of fire. Hive structures collapsed into molten ruin as atmospheric ignition spread across industrial zones. The ship lifted just as the surface beneath them disappeared into planetary collapse. For a brief moment, the Mandalorian saw the child through the cockpit viewport as they ascended. Grogu held onto him tightly. The Psyker child remained silent, watching the destruction unfold without resistance. Then the atmosphere broke apart behind them. Helios Reach ceased to be a world and became a burning fragment of light swallowed by orbital fire. Only silence remained where it had been. The moment Helios Reach died, something in the surrounding void changed. It was not a sound or an explosion that carried outward, but a pressure, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Ships traveling normal routes began reporting distortions in navigational drift, as if space itself had lost confidence in its own structure. Across nearby systems, long-dormant cult cells woke without instruction, speaking names they claimed they had never learned. Entire populations fell into sudden episodes of shared hallucination, describing the same presence moving behind their thoughts. On board the Mandalorian's ship, the effect arrived earlier than anyone else could measure it. Grogu was the first to feel it clearly. He did not react with movement or sound, but with stillness. His attention locked toward the center of the ship where the child rested, as if listening to something without words. The force around him became unstable, compressed in some places, stretched in others, like an unseen tide pressing against fragile boundaries. Then the ship began to fail in small, unnatural ways. Gravity shifted without warning, forcing objects to drift sideways before snapping back into place. Reflections in polished metal surfaces lagged behind movement, repeating actions that had already ended. At times, faint whispering voices threaded through the internal comm systems, speaking in tones too fractured to interpret, yet too deliberate to dismiss as static. The Psyker child was awake during all of it. He did not scream. He did not resist. Instead, his visions came in violent bursts, moments of overlapping realities, each one bleeding into the next. In some, the ship was intact. In others, it was already broken apart in impossible directions. His emotional state did not stabilize between them, it accumulated pressure with no release. The Mandalorian adapted immediately. He secured all compartments, sealed non-essential corridors, and moved through the ship with controlled urgency, keeping both children within proximity. His focus remained practical, but the environment no longer respected practicality. Doors opened into wrong angles. Hallways extended farther than the ship's exterior should have allowed. Then the first external reaction arrived. Nearby systems began reporting coordinated anomalies. Entire colonies experienced synchronized outbreaks of violence or panic. Void stations recorded unexplainable fluctuations in sensor arrays, as if something massive was moving just outside perception. Warp readings rose without translation into physical causality. A chaos presence followed. It did not arrive through conventional travel. It emerged in fragments of influence first, symbols appearing on internal surfaces, temperature drops in sealed compartments, and voices that answered thoughts instead of speech. The entity that followed these signs was not fully formed when it entered the ship, but it was already aware enough to hunt. The manifestation took shape inside the corridor leading to the cargo hold. It was incomplete, unstable, as if the warp had failed to agree on what it should become. The air around it tore slightly, revealing layers of impossible color and motion behind reality. It moved toward the child. The Mandalorian did not hesitate. He engaged at close range, weapon fire striking both physical and non-physical aspects of the entity. Some shots passed through it harmlessly. Others disrupted its form long enough to slow its advance. The corridor became a confined battlefield of collapsing geometry and flickering perception. Grogu reacted instinctively. A defensive force surge expanded outward from him, not aggressive, but stabilizing. It pushed against the entity's presence, creating a temporary boundary where reality briefly reasserted itself. The Psyker child responded at the same moment. Not with intention, but with overload. A psychic surge erupted from him that did not travel like force or energy, but like correction. The demon's form fractured mid-motion, collapsing inward as if its existence had been invalidated at a structural level. What remained disintegrated into scattered warp residue that dissolved before it could reform. Silence followed. But it was not relief. It was recognition. The Mandalorian reviewed the incoming navigational data. Every available route was failing. Not blocked. Not destroyed. Unmade. The ship drifted at the edge of a growing storm front, where reality and the warp were beginning to overlap without boundary. No direction forward remained stable enough to trust. For the first time, escape was no longer a matter of choice. Only timing. The void station at the edge of the Morvain drift was not built for order. It was built for transactions that required distance from law, identity, and consequence. Docking clamps held together layers of scavenged hulls, forgotten Imperial wreckage, and pirate manufactorums welded into a single drifting city. The Mandalorian arrived for repairs. The Razor Crest-class gunship had suffered more than mechanical strain. The warp passage had left residual instability in its systems, navigation drift, intermittent power fluctuations, and subtle structural fatigue that no standard workshop could fully understand. Supplies were necessary, but so was silence. That was harder to find. Grogu remained close, unusually alert. Before they even docked, he reacted to the station. Not visually. Not audibly. Something about it carried intent, like too many minds thinking in the same direction at once. His attention sharpened, and for a brief moment, he reached outward through the force as if confirming what he already feared. The Mandalorian noticed. "You feel it?" he asked. Grogu did not answer, but his expression tightened. Inside the station, the first hour passed in controlled negotiation. Black market engineers inspected the ship. Criminal brokers discussed pricing. Nothing unusual for this sector of space, until the bounty alerts began to propagate through internal networks. The Mandalorian did not see them at first. He felt the shift in behavior. Conversations paused. Hands moved closer to concealed weapons. Attention reoriented around him in ways that were no longer transactional. Then came the first attempt. A group of mercenaries near the docking corridor moved simultaneously, too coordinated to be coincidence. The Mandalorian responded without delay. Blaster fire erupted in narrow hallways where structural plating was already unstable. One shot detonated a conduit, causing secondary explosions that rippled through adjacent levels. The station did not handle violence well. It began to fail structurally almost immediately. Emergency alarms activated too late. Bulkheads sealed incorrectly. Entire sections of the docking ring entered partial decompression as pressure systems collapsed under sabotage and crossfire. Grogu reacted before the ambush fully formed. He turned sharply toward the far corridor seconds before the attackers emerged. That moment of anticipation saved distance, not time. The Mandalorian adapted instantly, shifting position to intercept the angle of attack rather than react to it. The firefight expanded. Mercenary gunships stationed outside the docking ring joined the pursuit as the trio escaped into the asteroid field beyond the station's perimeter. The void became a fragmented battlefield of drifting debris, broken hull fragments, and intermittent weapons fire cutting through darkness. Inside the chaos, the Psyker child did something unexpected. He did not speak or move. Instead, his attention tracked incoming fire trajectories before they occurred. Attack vectors that had not yet formed in physical space were already present to him as unstable possibilities. The Mandalorian used this without fully understanding it, adjusting evasive patterns based on predictions that were not his own. For a brief interval, Grogu and the child aligned. Not through language, but perception. A shared moment of understanding passed between them, fragile, incomplete, but real enough to alter behavior. Grogu's expression softened slightly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. The child was not simply unstable. He was alone inside what he could perceive. The Mandalorian noticed the change. Not in detail, but in trust. The child did not follow commands. He followed Grogu. That fact carried more weight than any tactical assessment. As they broke through the asteroid field, new signals appeared on long-range scans. Imperial assassin craft. Silent, precise, already closing distance from multiple vectors. At the same time, interference patterns within the station revealed manipulation signatures consistent with chaos influence, subtle distortions guiding pursuit rather than leading it. This was no longer a single hunt. It was convergence. The station behind them fractured under continued decompression failures, sections breaking apart into drifting wreckage as secondary explosions spread through its core. No faction controlled it anymore. It simply collapsed into competing violence until nothing coherent remained. The Mandalorian pushed the ship beyond standard burn limits. Behind them, pursuit continued into open void. Ahead, the galaxy had already begun to organize itself around a single fact. They were no longer escaping. They were being contained. The forge world of Ryza Ven had no horizon. Its surface was a continuous architecture of industry, megaforges, plasma chimneys, and continent-sized manufactorums layered over one another in endless ascent. The sky was not sky at all, but a heat-hazed ceiling of smog and orbital traffic lights bleeding through particulate storms. The Mandalorian arrived under escort he did not trust. Mechanicus vessels flanked his approach with silent precision, their signals reduced to machine-lit prayers and encrypted bursts of logic. No warmth accompanied the welcome. Only calculation. Grogu remained unusually still during descent. The child beside him was also quiet, observing the vast machine world with a kind of internal awareness that did not match his physical restraint. The Force, however, was no longer calm. It reacted to the forge world in unstable ripples, as if something beneath the metal layers was answering back. From the moment they landed, the child was taken. Not forcibly, but decisively. The Mechanicus did not ask permission. They redirected custody through procedure, containment doctrine, and silent authority. Within sealed analytical sanctums, layers of scanning arrays dissected the subject without touch. Data streams flooded cogitator banks across the facility. What they found did not converge into explanation. Genetic structure that refused classification. Biological systems that behaved like layered contradictions. Neural architecture that responded to warp proximity not with corruption, but with adaptation, like a system designed to interface with instability rather than resist it. The conclusions fractured into competing theories almost immediately. A relic of Dark Age experimentation. A pre-imperial design hidden before recorded history. An engineered evolution of psychic potential, refined into a controllable instrument. Or something worse, a construct that had never been intended to remain stable in real space at all. Grogu reacted strongly to the containment protocols. Not in aggression, but in proximity. He positioned himself closer to the child whenever allowed, as if compensating for something the Mechanicus failed to recognize, the emotional and perceptual isolation surrounding the subject. The two children did not communicate in words, but their awareness synchronized intermittently, especially when external pressure increased. Then the Forge world broke its internal silence. Conflict erupted within the Mechanicus hierarchy. Data disagreements became doctrinal division. Division became armed enforcement. Factions formed rapidly, those who sought containment and study, those who argued for weaponization, and those who concluded immediate destruction was the only acceptable outcome. Before resolution could stabilize, external forces arrived. Chaos infiltration did not announce itself. It replaced sections of the Forge world from within, corrupted data loops, machine spirits turning erratic, entire production lines reversing function. Demon engines emerged inside manufacturing sectors without warning, as if they had always been part of the system waiting to activate. The war escalated across planetary scale. Titan engines were deployed in response, their footsteps collapsing industrial districts as they engaged corrupted war machines across megacity corridors. Entire production continents became battlefields, machinery collapsing into molten ruin under overlapping weapons fire and warp distortion. The Mandalorian moved through it without alignment to either side. He extracted the children from containment during the initial collapse of analytical sanctums. The route out was no longer structured. Corridors changed shape under stress. Structural logic failed as the planet itself became a contested machine. Grogu stayed close, focused entirely on maintaining a protective presence around the child whenever instability peaked. At times, reality around them steadied for seconds at a time, enough to move, enough to survive. But the Forge world was already falling inward. Titan duels shattered factory skylines. Demon engines tore through refinery cores. Entire manufacturums collapsed into chain reactions of industrial failure, feeding the destruction faster than it could be contained. By the time they reached extraction, the planet was no longer coherent as a system. Only fragments remained. In the final transmission retrieved from Mechanicus archives before data loss, one conclusion repeated across all surviving cores. The subject predates current Imperial record-keeping. Not ancient history. Not forgotten history. Outside it. The intercept came without warning. A Space Marine strike cruiser emerged from real space distortion ahead of their vector, its silhouette vast enough to eclipse distant starlight. Vox channels opened with no negotiation, only authorization protocols and execution codes. Within minutes, boarding torpedoes were already in transit. Impact followed. The Mandalorian felt the ship shudder as hull sections were breached in synchronized strikes. Internal alarms failed to maintain consistency as entire corridors decompressed and resealed in rapid cycles. The enemy did not board like pirates or mercenaries. They entered like a corrective force. Astartes kill teams moved through the corridors with absolute certainty. The first contact was violent and immediate. The Mandalorian engaged at close range where numbers and scale mattered less than positioning. Beskar absorbed the initial exchange of fire, but not the pressure of proximity. The corridors became choke points of broken structure, muzzle flashes, and heavy impacts that reshaped bulkheads. Space Marines did not hesitate. They advanced through damage as if it were irrelevant to their progress. Grogu remained inside the ship's protected core with the child. The environment there was unstable but not yet compromised. When pressure waves from the boarding assault reached them, Grogu instinctively expanded a protective presence, not enough to dominate, but enough to resist collapse long enough for survival to remain possible. The child did not react with fear. Instead, he responded to the presence approaching them. For the first time, the Space Marines felt it when they reached the internal containment route. Not sound. Not vision. A direct psychic intrusion. Brief, uncontrolled, and overwhelming enough to fracture momentary cohesion in several Astartes units. Some recoiled. Others experienced involuntary visions, fragmented perceptions of impossible structures, collapsing realities, and something vast observing from beyond comprehension. Command discipline held, but only barely. The child was captured. Containment teams moved quickly, adapting null fields and restraining protocols to secure the subject. Grogu was separated during the extraction attempt, forcing a short, silent moment of resistance that ended not through force, but through tactical inevitability. Before the situation could stabilize, the void outside changed again. A Chaos fleet arrived at the edge of engagement range. No transition. No warning cycle. Only emergence, ships forming from unstable warp rupture like wounds opening in space. Their presence disrupted Imperial formation integrity instantly. What followed was not a battle in sequence, but in convergence. Imperial Astartes formations attempted to maintain control. Chaos forces broke formation logic entirely. The Mandalorian was forced into movement between collapsing tactical environments where neither side remained predictable. For a brief period, survival replaced allegiance. Temporary coordination emerged between Imperial and Mandalorian actions, not through agreement, but through shared necessity. Kill zones stabilized just long enough to prevent immediate annihilation. Then collapsed again under overlapping fire and warp distortion. The void around them became unstructured war. Ships burned without trajectory consistency. Boarding actions repeated across fractured hull sections. Entire formations disappeared into warp shear zones before reappearing elsewhere in broken states. In the chaos of fragmentation, the Mandalorian reached the containment vessel holding the child. He did not recover him cleanly. He extracted him. The difference mattered. The moment separation occurred, systems around them destabilized further, as if the conflict itself had been anchored to the child's position and now lost its point of focus. They escaped into fractured space as both fleets continued collapsing into engagement with each other. Behind them, the void battle dissolved into expanding instability. Ahead, the warp storm opened wider, offering no safe vector, only movement through uncertainty. Survivors did not regroup. They scattered. Karen Gate was already breaking before they arrived. The hive system stretched across 3 inhabited worlds linked by ancient transit arteries and orbital manufactoria, all of it now collapsing under coordinated chaos incursion. Warp breaches opened like wounds across the planetary surfaces, spilling distortions into already failing evacuation corridors. Billions attempted to flee through routes that no longer existed in stable form. The Mandalorian entered the system during the early collapse phase. No welcome. No clearance. Only distress signals repeating in loops until they degraded into noise. On the primary hive world, entire districts were trapped between sealed transit layers and falling infrastructure. The scale of civilian loss was not theoretical, it was immediate, visible, and accelerating. Infrastructure systems failed faster than emergency protocols could adapt, turning evacuation into containment of mass death. Din Djarin moved into the surface zone without waiting for authorization. He did not engage as a soldier of any faction. He operated as a rescue asset in a collapsing environment where survival depended on proximity, timing, and precision. Civilian groups were extracted from broken transit shafts, collapsing hub bridges, and sealed industrial corridors where pressure systems were failing. Grogu remained active throughout the operation. He guided movement instinctively, sensing danger before structural failure occurred. In several instances, entire sections of hive infrastructure collapsed moments after evacuation routes were cleared, as if his awareness was offsetting inevitability rather than preventing it. The Psyker child was already present in the system before they understood the scale of the invasion. His influence was not controlled. It was reactive. Where population centers collapsed under warp stress, structures briefly stabilized long enough for evacuation corridors to form. Entire hab blocks remained intact seconds longer than physical laws should have allowed. Thousands survived situations that should have been terminal. But the effect was inconsistent. For every stabilized sector, another area ruptured under uncontrolled psychic feedback. Demonic breaches expanded through weakened zones, turning sealed infrastructure into access points for entities that did not belong in real space. Chaos corruption spread through the hive like a living contamination. Imperial response escalated rapidly. Orbital platforms initiated preliminary purging protocols, targeting compromised zones with precision strikes designed to contain spread. The result was partial success and total collapse in equal measure, saving some regions while erasing others entirely. On the ground, Mandalorian extraction efforts intersected with Imperial observation units. Commanders witnessing the psychic stabilization events reported anomalies that did not fit doctrinal interpretation. Entire civilian clusters surviving direct exposure to warp breaches without corruption. Infrastructure reinforcing itself under impossible conditions. A child at the center of it all, acting without visible intent yet producing measurable large-scale effects. Inquisition assets arrived shortly afterward. Their internal assessments fractured immediately into opposing doctrines. Some classified the child as an existential anomaly requiring immediate destruction before escalation. Others argued for containment under extreme isolation protocols. A smaller faction demanded controlled study, citing potential strategic advantage beyond current Imperial understanding. None of the positions achieved consensus. During the conflict, Mandalorian operations prioritized extraction of civilians and stabilization of movement corridors. Grogu remained close to both the Mandalorian and the child, maintaining a fragile equilibrium of influence that prevented total collapse in localized zones. By the time Orbital Command attempted full system purging, the window for decisive control had already closed. What remained of Karen Gate was no longer a unified hive system. It was a fragmented war zone held together only by competing forms of instability. In the aftermath, Imperial record designation changed without formal announcement. The Mandalorian was marked as a heretic protector. Not because of declared allegiance, but because survival patterns no longer aligned with acceptable doctrine. The galaxy did not react all at once. It fractured into responses that began far apart and converged too quickly to be coincidence. Across systems long declared dead, dormant Necron tomb worlds registered activation sequences that had not occurred in millions of years. Deep beneath planetary crusts, machines that had outlived civilizations began to remember function. The trigger was not understood. Only its origin was consistent. The Psyker child signal, unstable, expanding, and increasingly incoherent, had propagated beyond known psychic range. It did not travel like communication. It behaved more like a disturbance in reality that spread until it encountered systems capable of responding. And something responded. Tomb worlds opened. Not with ceremony, but with precision. Monolithic structures rose from buried vaults, awakening entire dynasties in synchronized silence. Tomb ships broke free from planetary depths, emerging from dead worlds that had not seen starlight since before Imperial record-keeping began. Across multiple sectors, space itself filled with the geometry of ancient machine intelligence reasserting presence. The Mandalorian's vessel was caught between these emergences during transit through a contested corridor. There was no warning cycle. One moment, space was empty. The next, it was occupied by silent fleets that did not announce arrival or intent. Necron vessels moved without visible propulsion, appearing as if reality simply allowed them to exist in new positions. Grogu reacted immediately. Not with aggression, but with fear. It was not the presence of violence that disturbed him, it was the absence of emotional resonance entirely. The Necrons did not project fear, anger, or intent. They existed as absolute negation of psychological signal, and to something as sensitive as Grogu, that absence felt like pressure. The psyker child reacted differently. His perception fractured. For the first time, his psychic output did not expand outward in instability, but collapsed inward in response to the Necron presence. Competing layers of reality perception overlapped and separated too quickly to stabilize. He was no longer perceiving a single coherent universe, but multiple incompatible interpretations at once. The Necrons identified the source almost immediately. Designation protocols activated across multiple dynastic command structures. The anomaly was classified not as a weapon, not as a psyker, but as a structural threat to reality coherence itself. A variable capable of destabilizing even their long-term calculations of universal entropy. Extermination protocols followed without deliberation. Fleet engagements began across multiple systems simultaneously. Not battles in the traditional sense, but systematic removal of planetary bodies deemed unstable or contaminated by the anomaly's influence. Entire worlds were erased in moments, reduced to atomic silence by weapons that did not leave debris, only absence. The Mandalorian found himself moving through a region of space where Imperial, chaos, and Necron presence overlapped without coordination or understanding. None of them acknowledged each other in the same way. Only the Necrons acted with consistent intent. Grogu remained close, visibly unsettled by the absence of emotional feedback from the machine fleets. The Force itself felt distorted in their proximity, as if interaction with living energy was not accounted for in their structure. The psyker child's condition worsened. Not through external pressure alone, but through internal fragmentation. Each Necron engagement produced additional instability in his perception of reality, as if his existence required coherence that was no longer available in the surrounding universe. The Mandalorian adjusted course repeatedly, attempting to maintain distance from full-scale Necron engagement zones, but the pattern was no longer navigable. The fleets were not chasing them. System-wide extermination had already begun. Space stopped behaving like distance. It began behaving like direction. Across the outer reaches of the segmentum, something vast shifted its course. Tyranid hive fleets, countless bio-ships moving as a single consuming intelligence, registered the psyker anomaly and adjusted their migration patterns without hesitation. Entire tendrils of the swarm broke from established feeding routes and reoriented toward the same collapsing center of disturbance. At first, it looked like coincidence. Then systems began to disappear. Outer colonies reported biosignatures vanishing mid-transmission. Astropathic choirs broke apart into static as planetary evacuation windows closed faster than they opened. Worlds were consumed in accelerating cycles, atmosphere stripped, oceans drained, crusts hollowed, leaving behind nothing but sterile orbiting remains. Chaos did not resist the convergence. It redirected it. Cult networks and warp entities embedded within contested systems amplified panic, sabotaged evacuation corridors, and accelerated Imperial defensive miscalculations. Where the hive mind consumed matter, chaos consumed structure. Together, they destabilized entire sectors from opposite directions. The Imperium responded by sealing space itself. Warp corridors were declared non-viable. Entire subsectors were isolated through emergency doctrinal lockdowns. Fleets were repositioned not to defend territory, but to abandon it in controlled collapse. The objective was no longer victory. It was containment of spread. None of it mattered. The Mandalorian saw the pattern before anyone else admitted it existed. They were not being pursued anymore. They were at the center of gravitational inevitability. Every major faction, Imperial, Chaos, Necron, Tyranid, was converging on the same collapsing region of space. Not because they coordinated, but because each system's logic independently resolved toward the anomaly as the highest priority variable in existence. Grogu felt it constantly now. The force no longer flowed around them in patterns of life or death. It pressed inward from all directions, like reality itself compressing toward a single point. His reactions became more difficult to stabilize. He remained close to both the Mandalorian and the child, but emotional strain was becoming visible in small, unsteady shifts of focus and breath. The psyker child was no longer stable. Control had become intermittent. Moments of clarity were followed by involuntary distortion events where local reality failed to maintain consistent structure. Even short-range perception became unreliable, as if the universe was no longer agreeing on what he was. Across multiple systems, void wars erupted simultaneously. Imperial fleets engaged Tyranid swarms while attempting to maintain defensive formation against chaos incursions. Necron forces erased entire engagement zones without distinction between combatants. No alliance survived contact with the expanding convergence field. The Mandalorian adjusted course repeatedly, but navigation no longer responded to conventional logic. Every attempt to escape redirected them closer to another conflict node. Safe corridors collapsed faster than they could be plotted. He understood the implication with growing clarity. The galaxy was no longer spreading outward. It was collapsing inward. And the child was at the center of that collapse. By the time the sector boundaries were formally redefined, the decision had already been made by reality itself. Entire regions of space were declared isolated war zones. Not by command. By absence of alternatives. Sol system did not fall in a single moment. It tightened first, like a wound closing around something already infected. Imperial command registers began reporting contact losses along the outer defense grid weeks before any fleet engagement reached Terra's orbit. Entire patrol wings vanished between transmission intervals. Supply convoys arrived empty or did not arrive at all. The approaches to the throne world became less like space lanes and more like narrowing corridors of survival. Then the wars arrived. Chaos armadas broke into real space along multiple vectors, their entry marked by ruptures in the warp that scarred the void around Mars and the outer defense rings. Necron incursions followed without warning, their ships materializing within firing range of Imperial bastions as if distance had no meaning. Tyranid bio fleets arrived as well, drawn in vast layered formations that began consuming system infrastructure at the edges of Sol's defensive perimeter. The Imperium responded with full mobilization. Every remaining fleet asset was redirected toward Terra. Defense protocols that had not been activated since the darkest recorded sieges were reinstated across orbital platforms and void fortresses. The system did not prepare for war, it remembered it. And still, the convergence continued. The Mandalorian moved through it as a fragment between collapsing certainties. He was no longer operating in open space. Every approach vector toward Terra was contested, folded, or rewritten by overlapping conflict zones. Imperial patrols engaged anything unidentified. Chaos forces targeted anything structured. Necron assets ignored distinction entirely. Tyranid swarms consumed whatever remained static long enough to be classified. He pushed through all of it. Not because the path was clear, but because none of the alternatives existed anymore. Grogu remained with him, visibly strained under the pressure of constant psychic distortion. The force around them no longer behaved like a field, it behaved like collapse. Emotional signals from billions of lives, multiplied across simultaneous war zones, compressed into an overwhelming background pressure that threatened to break coherence. He stayed close to the child. The psyker child had reached a threshold state. No longer simply unstable, his presence now produced cascading reality fractures in localized zones around Terra's orbit. Ships entering proximity reported time desynchronization events. Weapon systems misfired due to causal misalignment. Entire engagements repeated in partial loops, as if moments of battle were failing to resolve into a single outcome. Chaos sorcerers attempted to exploit the instability. A coordinated ritual began across multiple fractured fleets, using the child as a focal anchor for warp ascension. The intent was not control, but transformation, forcing reality to accept a rewritten structure centered on psychic singularity. The Mandalorian reached the inner orbital layers during this phase. What remained of his ship was compromised. Hull integrity fluctuated. Navigation systems were unreliable. He continued manually, moving through debris fields formed from destroyed Imperial, Chaos, and Necron vessels all intersecting in the same collapsing region of space. The engagement that followed was not survivable. He fought anyway. Boarding actions, intercept fire, and structural collapse occurred simultaneously as multiple factions converged on the same corridor of space leading toward the Imperial Palace approach vectors. The Mandalorian was critically wounded during the extraction corridor breach, injury sustained while preventing separation of Grogu and the child during overlapping assault conditions. Grogu remained in direct proximity to both him and the Psyker child throughout the entire sequence, maintaining a fragile stabilizing influence that prevented total psychic cascade in localized space. But stability was ending. As they crossed the final orbital threshold, the child stopped resisting. There was no visible transition. Only release. The psychic pressure that had defined the entire convergence event ceased being contained within fluctuations and became continuous presence. The child entered full psychic awakening. The moment of awakening did not feel like an event. It felt like the end of distinction. Above Terra's fractured orbit, where fleets from every known faction still clashed in overlapping layers of war, the Psyker child stopped reacting to the conflict entirely. The distortion fields around him stabilized into a single coherent presence, as if every unstable outcome that had been competing for reality had finally resolved into one irreversible state. The Mandalorian reached him through debris and collapsing engagement zones, armor cracked, systems failing, movement reduced to persistence rather than strength. Grogu remained with him, quiet now in a way that carried weight rather than fear. The pressure that had defined everything since Helios Reach was no longer escalating. It was settling. For a brief moment, there was no war. Only proximity. The Mandalorian looked at the child without weapon, without objective, without calculation. What remained was not a mission anymore. It was a boundary between what could still be held and what could no longer be contained. Grogu stepped forward first. The connection between them was immediate, no words, no instruction. Only recognition across different forms of perception. The child responded to it not with instability, but with clarity that had never fully existed before in his state of being. There was no fear in him now. Only decision. He did not escape the galaxy. He released it. The transition into the warp was not violent. There was no rupture, no tearing of reality in the traditional sense. Instead, it was as if something that had been forcing existence into unstable alignment simply stopped applying pressure. The warp responded instantly. Chaos entities collapsed without form, dissolving into incoherent fragments that could not maintain identity. Entire fleets of demon constructs disintegrated mid-engagement. Warp storms that had consumed sectors for millennia vanished without residual turbulence, as if they had never been structurally permitted to exist in the first place. Necron systems, already operating on logic external to psychic reality, fell silent across multiple dynasties. Not destroyed, disengaged. As though the variable they had been calculating against had been removed from all possible equations. Tyranid hive fleets lost coordination across vast distances. The synaptic cohesion that had unified them fractured into directionless dispersal. Consumption patterns broke apart, and the great convergence that had driven them toward singularity dissolved into scattered, uncoordinated motion. Imperial astropathic communication failed entirely. Not corrupted. Absent. The galaxy did not become peaceful. It became unaddressed. The Mandalorian remained at the edge of the event horizon where perception itself stopped behaving consistently. Grogu stood beside him, watching as the warp, once a screaming, endless presence beneath reality, collapsed into silence. Not absence of space. Absence of echo. The Psyker child was no longer present in any measurable sense. Only the aftereffect remained. Reality did not revert. It stabilized into a configuration no existing civilization recognized or could interpret against prior history. The Mandalorian's fate was not recorded beyond this point. There were no further transmissions. No recovery logs. No confirmed survival signatures. Only the final state of the galaxy, altered without announcement. A quiet universe. No warp storms. No demonic presence. No psychic screaming beneath the stars. And something fundamental, no longer defined by any known empire, still holding the shape of what came after.